The Riverside Community Center had been transformed for the annual Christmas talent show. Twinkling lights strung across the ceiling, a modest tree in the corner, folding chairs arranged in rows. Nothing fancy, but warm and welcoming in the way only small-town gatherings could be. James Harrington stood in the back, hands in the pockets of his tailored suit, feeling utterly out of place. At 35, he was the CEO of Harrington Industries, a tech company worth hundreds of millions. He'd flown in from New York that morning for a business meeting with the mayor about a potential factory expansion. The meeting had ended early, and his assistant had mentioned this Christmas event as good optics for community relations. So here he was attending a children's talent show in a town of 3,000 people, checking his watch every 5 minutes and wondering when he could politely leave. The performances were exactly what you'd expect. Off-key singing, clumsy dance routines, a magic trick where the rabbit refused to cooperate. The audience of parents and grandparents applauded enthusiastically for every child. But James felt nothing. He hadn't felt much of anything since his wife Sarah died 2 years ago in a car accident. Work had become his only companion, profit margins his only passion. And now, the MC announced, we have a very special performance. Little Sophie Chen will play piano for us. Sophie just turned 5 last week, and this is her first time performing in public. Let's give her some encouragement. The audience applauded warmly as a tiny girl in a red velvet dress walked to the upright piano at the front of the room. She had blonde curls held back with a pink ribbon and wore an expression of intense concentration that would have been adorable if James had been capable of finding anything adorable anymore. Sophie climbed onto the piano bench, her legs barely reaching the pedals, and adjusted herself carefully. She looked out at the audience with huge, blue eyes that seemed to hold some private sadness, then placed her small hands on the keys. What happened next made James's heart stop. The little girl began to play Clair de Lune, Debussy's masterpiece, the piece Sarah had played at their wedding 7 years ago. But this wasn't the simplified children's version. This was the real composition, technically demanding, emotionally complex, requiring years of training and mature understanding. And this 5-year-old was playing it perfectly. Her tiny fingers moved across the keys with impossible precision, drawing out the haunting melody with a depth of feeling that seemed impossible from someone so young. The room fell into stunned silence. This wasn't a child plunking out Twinkle Twinkle Little Star. This was genuine artistry. James felt his throat close. He was hearing Sarah again, hearing the music she'd loved, played exactly the way she'd played it. The memories crashed over him. Sarah at the piano in their Manhattan apartment, playing this same piece on quiet Sunday mornings, her fingers on the keys, her voice humming along, the way she'd close her eyes during the most beautiful passages, lost in the music. Tears streamed down his face before he realized he was crying. The first tears he'd shed since Sarah's funeral, when he'd been too numb with shock to feel anything. Sophie finished the piece and sat very still for a moment before looking up at the audience with those ancient, sad eyes. The room erupted in applause. People standing, cheering, many of them crying without fully understanding why. James pushed through the crowd toward the piano. He had to know, had to understand how this was possible. Sophie's father appeared beside her, a man in his late 30s wearing a worn but clean button-down shirt, with the same blonde hair as his daughter. He put a protective hand on Sophie's shoulder as James approached. That was... James couldn't find words. How did she learn to play like that? Sophie looked up at him with those heartbreaking eyes. Sir, I learned this song from my mommy. Sophie's mother was a concert pianist, her father said quietly, his voice rough with emotion. Victoria Chen. She taught at Juilliard before we moved here 3 years ago for a quieter life. Was. James caught the past tense. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to intrude. It's all right. The father, Thomas, James would learn later, gave a sad smile. Victoria died 14 months ago. Cancer. She was only 32. He looked down at Sophie with infinite tenderness. Before she died, she spent every day teaching Sophie this piece. It was her favorite. She said music was the only thing that would last after she was gone, and she wanted Sophie to have something to hold on to. Sophie nodded seriously. Mommy said when I play this song she's still with me, that the music remembers her, even when the remembering is hard. James crouched down to Sophie's eye level, not caring that his expensive suit was touching the dusty floor. Your mommy was right, and she would be so proud of you. That was the most beautiful thing I've heard in a very long time. Were you crying? Sophie asked with childlike directness. I saw you in the back. I was. My wife used to play that song. She died too, a little while ago. Hearing you play it made me remember her. Sophie considered this, then did something that shattered what remained of James's carefully constructed walls. She reached out and took his hand. Then the music remembered her for you. That's what Mommy said it does. It remembers the people we love. James broke. He sat on the floor of that community center and sobbed. Great, gasping sobs that came from somewhere deep in his chest, where he'd locked away 2 years of grief. Sophie's father put a hand on his shoulder but didn't speak, understanding that some moments required silence. When James could breathe again, he looked up at Thomas. I'm sorry, I haven't been able to, I understand, Thomas said simply. Grief has its own timeline. Over coffee afterward, James had forgotten about leaving, forgotten about New York and business and everything except the need to understand this connection he felt. Thomas told him more. Victoria had been diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer shortly after they moved to this small town. She'd spent her final months teaching Sophie everything she could, pouring her knowledge and love into her daughter through music. She was adamant that Sophie learn that particular piece, Thomas said. Spent hours every day with her, even when she was so weak she could barely sit up. I didn't understand the urgency then, but now I see she was leaving Sophie a piece of herself. Something concrete to hold on to when memory fades. How are you managing? James asked. Raising her alone? Thomas's smile was tired, barely. I work 2 jobs, day shift at the hardware store, night shift doing maintenance at the hospital. My mother watches Sophie during the day, but I can't afford proper piano lessons for her. We have the old upright Victoria's parents gave us, and I try to help Sophie practice what her mother taught her, but I'm not a musician. I'm just trying to keep my head above water and make sure Sophie knows she's loved. James thought about his empty penthouse, his enormous salary, the money sitting in accounts because he had nothing and no one to spend it on. What if I could help? The words were out before he'd fully formed the thought. We don't need charity, not charity, an investment. James leaned forward. Your daughter has extraordinary talent. With proper training, she could do anything. Juilliard, concert halls, whatever she wants. I'd like to set up a trust fund for her education and music lessons. In Sarah's name. My wife would have loved supporting a young musician. Thomas looked torn between pride and practicality. That's too much. Please. James's voice cracked. I've spent 2 years not knowing how to honor Sarah's memory, not knowing how to feel anything. Your daughter's music broke through that tonight. Let me do this. Not for you, for me. Because I need to do something meaningful with what I have, or I'm going to lose myself entirely. 5 years later, James sat in Carnegie Hall, watching 10-year-old Sophie Chen perform in a young artist showcase. She'd blossomed under the training of New York's finest piano teachers, all paid for through the Sarah Harrington Memorial Music Foundation that James had established. But, more than that, Sophie and Thomas had become his family. James had moved his company's headquarters to their small town, built a state-of-the-art facility that brought jobs and prosperity to the community. He had dinner with them every Sunday. He'd been there for Sophie's first day of school, her first lost tooth, every recital and milestone. Thomas had become his best friend, the brother he'd never had, and Sophie called him Uncle James, lighting up whenever he walked in the room. The foundation had expanded beyond just Sophie. It now provided music education to dozens of children who couldn't afford lessons, gave grants to young musicians, supported music programs in schools. All because a little girl had played her mother's favorite song and reminded a lonely CEO that beauty still existed in the world. After the concert, Sophie ran to James backstage, still glowing from her performance. Did you hear? I didn't miss a single note. You were perfect, James said, hugging her tight. Both your mothers would be so proud. Both? Your mommy who taught you, and my Sarah, whose memory you're honoring every time you play. James looked at Thomas over Sophie's head, seeing the same gratitude and affection reflected in his friend's eyes. "You gave me a family when I thought I'd lost mine forever." That's what the music remembered. It remembered how to love. Sophie squeezed him tighter. "Uncle James, are you crying again? Happy tears this time, sweetheart. Just happy tears. Because sometimes a 5-year-old plays a piano piece at a small-town Christmas show, and it saves a life. Sometimes music remembers what we've forgotten, how to feel, how to connect, how to love again. Sometimes the loneliest CEO finds family in unexpected places, and a little girl's inheritance from her dying mother becomes a gift to the world." James still missed Sarah every day. But he'd learned something from Sophie's courage in playing her mother's song despite her grief. Love doesn't end when people die. It transforms. It flows into new relationships, new connections, new ways of honoring what was while building what can be. The music remembered. And in remembering, it had given them all a second chance at joy. Years later, when Sophie performed at Juilliard, a full scholarship, just as her mother had dreamed, James sat in the audience between Thomas and his own new wife Anna, whom he'd met through the foundation. His heart was full in a way he'd thought impossible after Sarah's death. Sophie played Claire de Lune as her opening piece, and somewhere, James liked to think, two mothers who'd never met were listening together, proud of the family their love had created and the lives their music had saved. Because that's what beauty does. It endures, it connects, it remembers. And sometimes, it's played by a 5-year-old in a red velvet dress who teaches a frozen heart how to beat again.